Welcome back to Compass, where we identify the spiritual in the everyday. My name is Ryan Dunn. There's a little bit to set up for this episode, as this episode premieres the day before a holiday in 2024. And that's not a strategically great day to release a podcast episode. But still, we're here for it. It's on the schedule. And actually, this provides an opportunity to do something just a little bit different. Compass was originally the podcast counterpart of the Rethink Church website. Rethink Church was a forum for exploring alternative expressions of church and for providing points of invitation and information for people curious about the Christian faith, but not quite yet immersed in the community of faith. The site was eventually rolled into the denominational website of the United Methodist Church, and actually in a few days, we're going to officially shut down the Rethink Church entity. But no fear, the Compass podcast will live on. I'm still here for the work, and we're going to continue asking the questions that we've been asking through the Compass podcast. We're still going to be looking for both the subtle and the crazy ways that faith impacts our everyday lives. In this episode, we wanted to give a nod to the contributions and great stories shared through Rethink Church over the past year. And actually, it's a continuation of a series that we used to do called the Rethink Church Audio Magazine. So we're going to share the audio versions of several of our most popular articles from 2024 with a few caveats. Personally, I tend to reuse stories or content wherever possible. This episode. So several of our most popular articles on the Rethink Church page already have podcast counterparts. And this includes some historic decisions in the United Methodist Church that was in May of 2024, and also some cool expressions of church that we detailed in Compass episode 141. Instead, we're going to focus on stories and ideas that haven't been previously shared on this podcast. You're going to get some fresh stuff here. So here's what's in store for this episode of Compass. Let's see if you can decipher an evolving theme through these articles. We'll start with a story from Joseph Yu called Making Prayer a Way of Life. Then we'll hear a story that I compiled called Embrace Silence, Hear God. Thirdly, we'll hear from our friend Nathan Webb in What Tabletop Games Teach the Church. We'll hear again from Joseph Yu in 3 Things to Look For in a Welcoming Church. Then another article from me. This one is entitled Sanctuary Comics and Games, An Innovative Approach to Building Faith. And then finally, we'll re-queue up Nathan Webb to hear Embracing Tomorrow and Redefining Church. All the articles are read by the authors, and it should be quite a journey. So let's settle into it with story number 1, Making Prayer a Way of Life, read by author Joseph Yu.
I want to start off by telling you, there's really no wrong way to pray. The only wrong way to pray is to really never pray at all. With that said, I do think that many of us may carry a very narrow view of what prayer really is. We may view prayer only as a time where we come before God and start asking for things. Sometimes even making prayer time transactional and bargaining. That is a part of prayer for sure. How many of us, even those who may not be Christian, have turned to prayer out of desperation? But prayer goes deeper than us requesting for some heavenly assistance. If we limit prayer to only asking God for stuff, the urging of pray continually may be difficult to fathom and more difficult to practice. There is a beautiful phrase I have learned, lex orandi, lex credendi, lex vivendi. Loosely translated, it means how we pray shapes how we believe, which shapes how we live. If we limit prayer to a transactional act, it may end up giving us a narrow and limited view of God. After all, the way we pray affects how we believe. The Reverend Adam Hamilton once said, breathing is to the body as prayer is to the soul. Prayer is not just something we do before we consume a meal or something to turn to when there's a pop quiz in a class we're already struggling in, or a time to make a plea bargain after breaking your parents' prized vase. Again, asking for help is a very important part of prayer, but there's more to prayer than simply asking for help. Prayer, in a nutshell, is how we communicate with God. Communication is an integral part of a healthy relationship. It's a skewed relationship if one party only communicates when they need something from the other. In prayer, we commune with God. We thank God. We praise God. We bless God. We adore God. We confess to God. We ask help from God. But also, prayer is not just limited to us talking. Listening is a very important part of communication in a relationship, and that applies to prayer as well. Sometimes sitting in silence contemplatively, listening for that thin, quiet sound is all the prayer we need. When it comes to speaking to God, speak the way you would speak to the person who is closest to you. Be honest, be raw, be angry, lament if you have to, cry, grieve, be joyous, offer gratitude, offer blessings and praise and adoration, ask for forgiveness, ask for wisdom and guidance, sit in silence surrounded by the presence of God. Set aside a time for intentional prayer, or pray on your walk, pray when you're stopped in traffic, pray while doing the dishes, offer a blessing when you witness something beautiful in nature. Prayer like this might feel very awkward at first. It feels like you're having a conversation with yourself, and you can become very self-aware of how silly this may all seem and feel. But the more you pray, the more natural it becomes. Jesus found it important to pray, and if it was important to Jesus, it is important to us. I believe that prayer sustained Jesus and his ministry. I believe that his prayer life gave him strength, refreshed, and renewed him in his ministry. And most importantly, it helped him stay in tune with God. Jesus modeled an intimate relationship with God, and I feel that intimacy had a lot to do with how much time he spent in prayer. The more we pray, the less we become preoccupied by the success rate of prayer, how often our prayers may be answered. After all, prayer is less about changing God's mind. As Kierkegaard said, the function of prayer is not to influence God, but rather to change the nature of the one who prays. If you're a seasoned vet in prayer, keep praying. If you're new to this, keep praying until it becomes like second nature to you. Continue to commune and communicate with God. May you see that prayer is more than just something we do here and there, something more than just a laundry list of requests, but that prayer is a way of living. So may we pray continually.
Embrace Silence, Hear God by Ryan Dunn, read by the author. Imagine a space where you are free to explore your questions and get in touch with the deep parts of your soul, all without the distractions and clamoring of the external world. Surprisingly, this space is all around us, and it is not overly difficult to access, but it is easy to miss it in the bustling rhythm of daily life. The space is silence. Subhead: Silence is a gateway. The benefits of silence are profound, especially for those seeking spiritual connection. In the Christian faith, particularly within the United Methodist tradition, silence is more than the mere absence of sound. It is a gateway to deeper spiritual understanding. For spiritual seekers, stillness offers a kind of sanctuary, a place where practitioners move past the distractions of the world and allow their souls to connect with something deeper. Silence fosters a sense of inner peace that transcends the superficial tranquility offered by temporary escapes. In the quietude, one finds a rare opportunity to confront and soothe the inner tumult that often goes unaddressed. In the stillness, the whispers of the Holy Spirit become audible, guiding and enlightening the seeker on their path. We often become most clear-headed in the midst of silence. Subhead: Silence isn't easy, but it's worth it. Many of us have a Pavlovian response to silence. When we encounter it, we immediately want to respond with noise or activity. We've been culturally programmed to believe that silence is not productive. Some of us are uncomfortable with silence because we fear deep introspection and what it might possibly reveal to us. We don't want to look that deeply into ourselves. Leaning into silence is worth the effort. The absence of noise reduces the body's stress response, leading to a more relaxed state. Less stimuli equate to a decreased need for our bodies to respond. This relaxed state can help reduce overall stress, restore cognitive resources that get exhausted by constant distraction, and lower blood pressure and heart rates. Silence can enhance mindfulness and promote a state of reflective introspection, which is beneficial for emotional health. It allows individuals to focus on the present moment and gain a deeper understanding of their emotions and thoughts. Much like Elijah encountered in 1 Kings 19, parenthesis, when he finally heard the soft voice of God in the quiet of solitude, end parenthesis, we can encounter a deeper sense of God's presence when we cultivate space for silence as part of our spiritual journey. Subhead, learn to cultivate silence. You will never be able to eliminate all noise from your environment, and it is unfair to insist that others adapt their habits or lifestyles to accommodate your need for silence. However, there are ways to introduce more silence into your life. Identify sanctuary spaces. Think of accessible physical locations in your life that conjure feelings of quietude. These should be set aside for the purpose of encountering silence and deep thought. Maybe there is a room in your home or a park near your neighborhood that is silent for a portion of the day. Many church buildings have prayer chapels. Make it a practice to regularly visit these silent sanctuaries in your life. Set personal boundaries. Silence is the absence of noise, so look for the noisy devices in your surroundings and distance yourself for a short time. Try placing your phone out of reach for 30 minutes and release your need to immediately respond to calls, texts, and emails. Schedule your silence. Many of us move through our lives on pretty tight schedules. Look at your day and find a consistent time that you can set aside for the experience of silence. Make a meeting with yourself to have a silent encounter. Give yourself something to do. Silence does not necessarily lack activity. It is perfectly acceptable to give yourself something to do in your silent space. A guided spiritual practice, meditation, or contemplative prayer will make full use of the silence and provide a platform for diving deeper into a spiritual experience. Some recommended practices for your silent experiences include centering prayer, welcoming prayer, Ignatian examen, breath prayer, and guided meditation.
Title: What Tabletop Games Can Teach the Church by Nathan Webb. As a gamer and pastor, I learned early in my studies that the church can learn something from the gaming community. It doesn't take long to observe the lines of fans at Comic-Con or the millions of viewers of YouTube shows like Critical Role to realize they're doing something right to foster community. In a recent interview on the Real Ones podcast, actress Deborah Ann Wall discussed her history with Dungeons & Dragons with the host John Bernthal. Her conversation showcases how a tabletop role-playing game, or TTRPG, can mirror the dynamics of a welcoming church. Her ability to guide players without controlling them, encourage creativity without enforcing rigid rules, and foster an inclusive environment offers a rich metaphor for how churches can cultivate a community where all members feel valued and empowered. Do you want to play D&D? Deborah Ann Wall's interview offers a masterclass on inviting someone into a new experience with grace and sensitivity. When John Bernthal, unfamiliar with Dungeons & Dragons, or D&D, expresses curiosity, Wall doesn't overwhelm him with rules or jargon. Instead, she immediately invites him to play, creating an immersive scenario where he can learn by doing. This approach suggests a way for churches to introduce newcomers to their community. Instead of bombarding them with doctrine or expectations, a church should invite them to participate in its life, learning by being a part of the community rather than just observing from the outside. I would describe Wall's style of being a dungeon master as grace-filled, guiding without imposing control. A dungeon master, or DM, like a pastor, sets the stage for the story, but allows the players to make their own choices and discoveries. This balance between guidance and freedom is essential for creating a welcoming and inclusive environment. Wall doesn't start by explaining character sheets or the intricacies of the game. Instead, she focuses on the immediate scenario, allowing Bernthal to engage with the game in an intuitive and accessible way. Similarly, churches should prioritize making new members feel at home before guiding them into more complex theological or organizational details. Churches foster more inclusive and welcoming community by meeting people where they are and allowing them to engage at their own pace. Subhead: House Rules. The concept of, quote, house rules, end quote, in TTRPGs is a powerful metaphor for how churches adapt to better serve their communities. Just as each gaming group might adjust the official rules to suit their preferences and needs, churches can develop practices and traditions to make their spaces more inclusive and welcoming. For instance, gaming groups I've been in have chosen to eliminate evil alignments or emphasize creative problem solving over combat, instituting what's known as the rule of cool. These decisions reflect the group's values and goals, creating an enjoyable play environment. In the church context, house rules might prioritize inclusivity and accessibility. For example, a church might be particularly welcoming to marginalized groups or emphasize service and community outreach over traditional worship practices. These house rules help create a space where everyone feels valued and included, regardless of their background or familiarity with the faith. One such house rule at the church I pastor revolves around prayer requests. Some church members with church trauma express feeling attacked when they are brought in as a prayer request without their consent. As a rule, we set the expectation that our prayers be focused on our own lives, not the gossip of others. A church can remain a community of welcome by being willing to adapt and evolve in response to the community's needs. Subhead: Yes and. The quote, yes and, end quote principle, a cornerstone of improvisational theater, is also vital in TTRPGs and church communities. This principle encourages participants to build on each other's ideas, creating a collaborative and dynamic environment. In a TTRPG, this might mean accepting a player's unconventional idea and working it into the story, rather than shutting it down because it doesn't fit the planned narrative. It could mean being open to new ideas and initiatives in a church, even if they challenge traditional practices or beliefs. This approach makes the game more engaging and fosters a sense of ownership and investment among the players. Similarly, a church that embraces the yes and principle is more likely to inspire its members to actively participate in the community, contributing their unique gifts and perspectives. This doesn't mean abandoning core beliefs or values, but instead being open to how those beliefs and values might be expressed or applied in new and creative ways. Subhead: Beware the grognards. Every TTRPG community has its share of grognards, longtime players who are deeply attached to traditional playing and can resist change. These individuals can act as gatekeepers, discouraging new players or those with different playstyles from fully participating. In a church setting, grognards might be those members who resist new ideas or cling to traditions that no longer serve the community. While their experience and commitment can be valuable, church leaders must ensure that these individuals do not stifle growth or innovation. When I planted a church for nerds, geeks, and gamers, the first advice I received from Reverend Derek White, the geek preacher, was to watch the grognards closely. Grognards' reluctance to embrace change creates barriers for newcomers and limits the church's ability to evolve and meet the needs of its members. A church must ensure that the grognard mentality does not take root. By fostering an environment that values openness, adaptability, and grace, a church can prevent gatekeepers from making the space less welcoming for others. Just as in a TTRPG, where the presence of grognards limits the group's ability to tell a good story, gatekeepers in a church can restrict its ability to grow and thrive. Subhead: A church by any other name. Deborah Ann Wall's approach to DMing offers valuable lessons for churches to create welcoming and inclusive communities. Church leaders set a tone that mirrors the best aspects of a well-run game by being inviting without being pushy, guiding without controlling, and encouraging creativity without enforcing rigid rules. Ultimately, TTRPGs and churches thrive when they embrace diversity, encourage participation, and foster a culture of growth and belonging. By learning from the grace and inclusivity exemplified in Wall's DMing, churches can become more welcoming, dynamic, and inclusive communities, where everyone is invited to play a part in the story.
Next up is 3 Things to Look For in a Welcoming Church by Joseph Yu.
We are a very welcoming church. No church in their right mind would ever say anything otherwise. But quite often, our actions betray our words. Too many times, churches who say they're welcoming are welcoming, but only to one another, the people they know. I remember sitting with a group of ushers who were lamenting that they had to go through some quote-unquote training because they've been ushers for such a long time. I showed them a picture from a previous Sunday where the ushers were standing in a circle and not noticing a family that nobody recognized walking by them. I asked them what they saw in the picture, and unsurprisingly, no one wanted to talk anymore. What happens is that when we've been part of a church for a long time, we completely take everything for granted. We just assume everyone knows where to go because I know where to go. Which is wild because nobody will act like that when we have first-time guests at our homes. We tell them where the bathrooms are, where they can find towels, where we keep our linens, etc. Here are some things you can look for to see if a church is really welcoming, as well as how to help your faith community make sure it's making meaningful connections. There are 3 things I would like to highlight as we talk about welcoming and hospitality in churches. The first impression your church makes on a guest isn't when they first pull up to your parking lot, it's the website. And far too many churches still ignore the importance of a website. There are way too many church websites that still look like they're preparing for Y2K. We all know first impressions matter, for better or worse. Know that the first impression one gets from your church is the website. The second area I see many churches falling short in is what happens after the benediction or right after the service ends. Most churches are great in welcoming guests before church starts. But after we are dismissed, we try to get out of the church property to beat the Baptists to lunch. I was once told that one of the loneliest moments in visiting a church is after the benediction because everyone knows where to go and they're all in a hurry to get there. So people who don't know are left to discover on their own where the children's pickup may be, or where the bathrooms are, or if there's a coffee and donuts. Ensure that your church is as intentional and diligent in their welcoming after service as they are before service. The final thing I'll share in this article is the 5-10 link rule. I do not know who came up with it, but it is something that everyone in church can practice, not just those who are on the welcoming team or ministry. 5 minutes before and after service, make sure you meet someone you never met. Avoid leading with the question, is this your first time? Because it may not be. They may have been there for years, but your paths never crossed. Simply offer a, I don't think we've met yet, or the simple, hi, my name is so-and-so, what's yours? The 10 refers to distance. When someone you haven't met is within 10 feet of you, go and greet them. Even if you're standing in an already established circle, have the courage to excuse yourself and break the circle to greet the person you haven't had the opportunity to meet yet. In fact, if you had to break the circle to greet them, invite them in the circle of fellowship you're already standing in, which leads to the last rule. Link. Link refers to connecting them to the other people in church. In the process of getting to know them, their name, where they're from, what they do, perhaps they have something in common with someone you already know. Maybe they just started teaching at a local elementary school and your friend works at the same school. Connect them to your friend. We cannot have a passive mindset when we're working on making people feel welcome. We have to be active and intentional and diligent. We also have to take a risk in the sense that we may have to step out of our comfort zone to really greet someone we may not know at church. People come to church not just to connect with God, but with God's people as well. Everyone is in need of a community. Each of us have the power and ability to help someone feel a sense of belonging in your community. Don't be passive with that responsibility. Make the best of it and continue to connect people to your community and to God.
Title: Sanctuary Comics and Games, an innovative ministry building community through comics and faith. Reported by Ryan Dunn and read by the author. Quote, "Oh, customers, how I hate them." End quote. The Simpsons comic book guy. Are you familiar with the comic book guy meme? It started in The Simpsons, the long-running animated TV series. Comic book guy is a recurring character who runs Springfield's local comic book store. Comic book guy has a deep passion for comics and fictional memorabilia. He also has a deep disdain for anyone lacking his level of passion in his areas of interest. Unfortunately, comic book guy is the impression many of us hold to in regards to comic book fans and their stores. We assume it's a bit of a hostile space and hobby. So a church investing in a comics and gaming store as a form of outreach and community intervention seems unreasonable. Yet, Village United Methodist Church in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, doesn't believe the stereotype, and they have invested in Sanctuary Comics and Games as a location for community building and spiritual nurturing. Subhead: Best Comics Store Ever. Nash Carey is the founder of Sanctuary and Village UMC's Minister of Community Engagement. As a neurodivergent veteran dealing with symptoms of PTSD, Nash is well aware that there are whole groups of people who need to encounter specialized communities in order to build nurturing relationships. During the days of COVID isolation, Nash began playing around with an online gaming space called Second Life. Quote, "I'm going to build this really cool church that everybody will come to church at in Second Life." It was kind of a place where people who all kind of have similar backgrounds all come together. End quote. The Second Life Church did not take off as planned, but it got Nash asking some important questions. Quote, "Where do nerds hang out? Where do we exist? And in the real world, the comic shop." End quote. A vision was born for providing a nurturing point of connection where Nash and others could live into their unique powers of community building. The first Sanctuary Games in comics was born in Edmonds, Oklahoma. Less than a year later, and with the help of Village United Methodist Church, a second sanctuary came to life in Oklahoma City. The store is not merely a business. It is a ministry providing pastoral care in a unique way, especially for those who may find it tough to connect in traditional church settings. Quote, "I'm trying to create a third space that's also a church community that they can thrive in. This is kind of like a chaplaincy," end quote, said Nash. The vision of Sanctuary is to meet people where they are through a non-intimidating third space and provide community and spiritual growth. Subhead, go where they are. Reverend Elaine Robinson, lead pastor of Village United Methodist Church, noted that the partnership of church and comic store seemed unnatural at first, but also that communities of faith are called to move towards the people they want to invite. Quote, "Just like John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, you can't expect people who aren't going to come to church to be disciples. You have to go where they are." End quote. Nash claimed to be one of those people needing a new space in which to belong. Quote, "But I don't fit in a regular church. I really didn't," he said. "So I stayed with the comic store. I believed in my mission and calling enough." End quote. The church began to believe in the calling too. Volunteers from the congregation, most of whom had little experience with comics, provided over 670 hours of labor in 1 month's time in order to prepare the new store in Oklahoma City for opening. They also provided $50,000 in funding to help acquire inventory and renovate the store's facilities. The preparation was part of the community building aspect of Sanctuary, and it was noticed in the surrounding community. Subhead, it's a God thing. One of Sanctuary's first employees was Jeremy Cartwright, a fellow veteran suffering from PTSD symptoms. Before Sanctuary opened, Jeremy had noted that the store's future location, quote, "would be a great spot for a comics shop," end quote. As Jeremy drove by one day, he noticed some activity happening at the location. Quote, "I thought, those look like comics in the window," end quote. Jeremy stopped and happened upon Nash in the parking lot. They quickly related over their fondness of comics and their experiences as veterans. Quote, It was weird because at that time in life, I needed someone to talk to about that kind of stuff. It was like God put Nash there," end quote, reported Jeremy. Orrin Williams had a similar serendipitous introduction to Sanctuary, finding the store only a few hours after moving to Oklahoma. Quote, "I met Nash and he told me about Sanctuary being a safe place, and there's a place for role-playing game Dungeons and Dragons," end quote, recalled Orrin. Quote, "And he said he's looking for dungeon masters right now, and that's funny because I am a dungeon master," end quote. Orrin started running Dungeons and Dragons games immediately. The game is an important part of Sanctuary's nurturing, community-building DNA. Orrin notes that his chief job is to be a storyteller, involving people in situations where they creatively overcome challenges together. Reverend Elaine noted, quote, "Everybody has to work together if you're going to win," end quote. Reverend Elaine also has a story of a positive chance meeting, with a woman taking her grandsons with her to a neighboring business. Instead of taking her grandsons with her to the nail salon, she asked if the boys could join in a game at Sanctuary. Afterwards, she offered that she was raising her grandsons and was excited to encounter this place for them to connect and be safe. Subhead, a new outreach. A model of ministry resembling Sanctuary comics and games requires the church to rethink involvement and membership. Quote, "It may not ever put them into the church, but there are lots of people who don't go to church who are part of that community," end quote, noted Nash. Both Village UMC and Sanctuary work to overcome a sense that the two entities are separate communities. On Sundays, Sanctuary closes retail operations but is open for Bible study and fellowship time. In many ways, Sanctuary provides an opportunity for church members to put their practices of discipleship on display. Reverend Elaine described the process. Quote, "Look, here's what it is to be a follower of Jesus who loves people and wants to connect. And you're welcome here." End quote. She continued, quote, "It's this gradual process of connecting with people as the starting point for discipleship and to show the love of Jesus Christ to people and meet them right where they are." End quote.
Title: Embracing Tomorrow and Redefining Church. I'm hot off the heels of the Futuring Forward, the Reawakening of the People Called Methodist conference. This hybrid event hosted hundreds of practitioners of the Fresh Expressions United Methodist FXUM movement, which has greatly expanded within the denomination over the past few decades. What is a fresh expression? The term itself has a few different takes depending on who you're asking. The FXUM website's official statement states that, quote, "A fresh expression of church is a new form of church which is trying to connect with people who don't normally go to church," end quote. Often, they're birthed from within the established church, but are distinctly outside of the bounds of anything that looks like church. In my call as a planner of an all-digital church and expression of the church, I've always considered myself related to the movement. Hence, I was elated to discover the first national gathering would be in my neck of the woods in Charlotte, North Carolina. This conference would see many keynote speakers and amazing workshops led by exciting practitioners of innovative ministries within the United Methodist Church. We broke bread together and talked about the hard realities of ministry, from financing to reaching the next generation. I was able to hang out with some good friends from within my own Western North Carolina conference, while also building a marshmallow tower with some delightful folks from conferences spanning the nation. In this article, I'd like to share 3 major takeaways from the good conversation and myriad notes. Subhead: Wesley left the building. Out of the myriad of keynotes, workshops, resources, and webinars, there were more than a few quotes that were quite poignant for the United Methodist denomination. Among these many quotes, one has stuck itself firmly in my heart. Quote, "John Wesley said that the world is my parish, but we've made the parish our world." End quote. These words, shared by author and pastor Reverend Michael Beck, rang throughout the hall of Providence United Methodist Church. Those gathered knew exactly what those words meant. Fresh Expressions is not new at all, but a historical echo of the field preaching of the father of the Methodist movement, John Wesley. The movement was built upon a call to go out into the world and preach the gospel, not cycle the stories within our brick buildings. This is a call to see beyond our reclusive reality and begin to work on, quote, doing church, end quote, out in the places where people don't call themselves Christians. While I would argue there's nothing fresh about this sentiment, I'll celebrate the reframing of our focus on doing the work of sharing Jesus in all places and spaces. Subhead: A growing diversity. When I first posted an image of myself at the event on social media, one of my friends asked about the diversity of the keynote speakers and workshop leaders. While this might often burden one with excuses over the whiteness of promoted scholasticism, I was delighted to share with them that I found the leadership undeniably diverse. Over 3 days, I attended more workshops hosted by BIPOC and AAPI leaders than white leaders. While the keynote speakers were slightly less varied, powerful BIPOC voices led the charge and stirred up the spirit in the room. The diversity was apparent amongst the United Methodist bishops gathered, of which there were 7, with at least 2 of the 7 being people of color. Present were Bishops Berlin from Florida, Shelton from North Carolina, Hagia, who's retired, Plambeck from South Dakota, Minnesota, Carter from Western North Carolina Conference, Wallace Paget from the Holston Conference, and Neely from the Bahamas Methodist. While I'm delighted by this apparent diversity, we can always do better with racial equity and inclusion. I'm thankful that the intentionality is immediately apparent at the first gathering. Anti-racist work is an ever-growing field, and this event's leadership is a hopeful sign pointing towards an even more diverse United Methodist Church going forward. Subhead: Thy beer mug runneth over. The first instance of Fresh Expressions I can recall is the Beer and Hymns movement. As someone who didn't see his Methodist elder father drink a beer until his late teens, I can recall being delighted and surprised by Beer and Hymns' real nature. Being able to drop the guilty pretense of being physically present in a bar felt much more authentic than other church get-togethers. Being in a third space out in the real world and not relegated to another cakewalk in the fellowship hall felt like I was able to lose the mask of Mr. Perfect Pastor and instead be vulnerable with those around me. After attending this conference, I can affirm that we've come a long way since then, and it was obvious by the conference programming. 3 days was nowhere near enough time to begin highlighting the plethora of expressions in the room. I couldn't even hope to list the various types that I heard from those gathered around my tables during conversations. There was so much that nearly every keynote and workshop ran overtime, and discussion between sessions kept attendees from entire portions of the itinerary. An example of this growing edge could be that, even in a jam-packed schedule, I was personally hard-pressed to find any digital Fresh Expressions offerings, save for one that was hosted by the Baltimore-Washington Conference's Reverend Ramon Jackson and Tyrone Fleming Moore. Even in conversation with these leaders, they also saw a need for further leadership in the realm of digital ministry within the Fresh Expressions movement. I call this out not to critique the gathering, but to highlight the desperate need for more events like this one. Evidenced by a jam-packed schedule that still didn't capture the field, the work of the Fresh Expressions United Methodist experience is only just beginning and is already quite expansive. God is clearly at work in a more diverse, more creative, more inclusive expression of the church of tomorrow.
That is a wrap for what looks to be our final Rethink Church audio magazine. Again, I want to mention that the Compass podcast will continue on. We've got an interesting episode on the book of Revelation. That's all queued up for our next release, so check that out in 2 weeks' time. If you need more Compass in the meantime, I recommend a couple of the episodes that I mentioned at the top of this episode. Episode 141, about some innovative faith communities. It's titled Community, Comedy, and Church Renovation. It's one of my favorites. Episode 132 was another big story from this year. That episode is called A Historic Shift in Inclusion for the United Methodist Church. My name is Ryan Dunn. Compass is a production of the United Methodist Communications, and we release new episodes every other Wednesday, unless, it's really disrupted by a holiday. And actually, that's going to be the case around Christmas time, but more on that, the specifics we'll get to next episode. In the meantime, I wish you peace.